Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us for this In Conversation With series. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the incredible Christine Burns MBE. Christine is a renowned political activist, health advisor, and campaigner who spent more than 30 years lobbying for the rights of trans people in the UK and beyond. Most recently, Christine has published Trans Britain, which is an anthology of essays and personal anecdotes outlining the lived experience of trans people over the course of the last century. Christine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So you have a pretty remarkable career, it's safe to say. I think we could spend a number of hours talking about any one of your accomplishments. But let's go back to the beginning. What was your introduction into the world of campaigning and political activism, and how did that come about?
Oh, goodness. I remember writing in the first book I wrote, that the first line is, I never planned to be an activist. And that was actually the thing. I grew up to be a computer scientist. That's what I wanted to do. Then I was a consultant for big companies in computers. And I was aware of politics, but I never really saw a role for myself as an activist. And let's face it, the way growing up that activists are usually presented to us via the mainstream media is not a good look. So it hadn't, it's one of those things. I think I became an activist, and when life really hit me between the eyes, and I realised that something needed to be done, and it wasn't going to get done unless some of us stood up and did it.
And I know you've done a lot of work with the organisation Press for Change. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you got involved with PFC and what kind of work you did?
Give you a very speedy background, which might sort of lop the legs off of the next question you're going to ask me. Is if you go back before the beginning of the 1990s, then although trans people had some support organisations focused on self-help, there was no activist group, and that was partly because the hand we'd been dealt with from the end of the 60s, taking away many rights that we already had, was such that I don't think anybody could see what we could possibly do. And the way I looked on it was that if there's an injustice, you would go to maybe the newspapers. Well, the job that the newspapers saw they had was to chase us down and put us on Sunday tabloids as titillation to sell newspapers. Or you could go to a member of parliament. But the way we were presented by the aforesaid newspapers meant that there were no votes in standing up for trans people. So those are two of the most obvious ways in which you might bring about any kind of change that could undo the mess we're in. And if those aren't open to you, then, and also you're just battling to survive because you've got no privacy, you've got no employment rights and so on, then you could say, well, the best we can do is to make sure we do these self-help groups well. So for 25 years, the organisation of trans people was really focused on what we could do to help each other survive. But then in the mid-80s, at the end of a long process, a trans man called Mark Rees got tired of this and had gone through all of the lower courts in Britain to try and challenge the status quo that said, for instance, that you can't change your birth certificate. And the practical implications of that for him and for all of us was that, firstly, none of us had any privacy or security, because let's say you get a job and it's a job that requires proof that you're a British citizen, or proof of your date of birth, or proof of both of those to join a company organisational pension scheme, then you'd have to hand over this piece of paper that was the only official ID you had, and which marked you out as, this is who you used to be. So you couldn't, and if you're outed simply by a process of getting a job, then the chances are you're not going to get the job. And everybody else is going to know, and you're in danger. So that was one side of it. The other side is that the legal implication of the state recognising him as a woman or saying that I was a man, is that he couldn't marry as he would wish to do. So if he was going to marry at all, it would be a woman. And we didn't do same-sex marriages in those days. He also wanted to train as a Church of England priest, and we didn't have women priests at the time either. So his career options were killed, and his options for settling down were destroyed as well. So he went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights in about, I think, 1986, and although he didn't win, there were dissenting voices among the judges who said, this can't be right. This is not what we want human rights to be about. And so he started a conversation. And as a result of that conversation, to cut a long story short, by about 1990-91, a Liberal Democrat MP, Alex Carlisle, had approached Mark and said, yeah, I'd like to help. And he got together with some friends, and they had a meeting where Alex Carlisle had said, to change this is probably going to take about 10 years at least. And he was pretty right on that. And you're going to have to form some kind of activist group. So that is actually what those founders did. That was a meeting on the 27th of February 1992 across the road from Westminster in a tea shop that no longer exists called Grandma Lee's. And people said, well, we're going to give this a name. And everyone was saying about how we need to press for change, we need to press for change. And then just somebody said, well, why don't we just call it that, Press for Change? And that's exactly how it was born. Now, the following year, I was constantly bumping into one of the founders, Stephen Whittle, because I'd gone to a conference of lawyers and medical specialists and politicians in Amsterdam, and he was there. And then later that year, I'd gone to a conference of what was then called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association in New York, and he was there. So he came up to me and said, would you like to get involved with this thing that we're doing? And that's how I got involved with Press for Change, in my case, at the end of 1993. So it'd been running for about a year and a half at that point. And there was very little to it in those days. In fact, there was never very much to it. It was a huge smoke and mirrors effort of volunteers. That there were half a dozen people who were called vice presidents, and we all had the same amount of responsibility, and largely to do the projects that we could bring some expertise to. And we had some basic documents. I remember we had some rules for campaigners, and we had a sort of manifesto. But in the early stages, starting off an activist group from scratch is really quite a hard thing to do. And this was before everybody had the internet as well, before the World Wide Web. I'd had email for some time, but one of the things I realised as soon as I started finding out about the World Wide Web was that this could solve one of the big problems that we had as a tiny volunteer group, was that the people we were trying to reach and represent were scattered. There was a very small number that we knew of, and they were scattered all over the country, and they didn't have much money because most of them were out of work. And consequently, how do you build anything out of a group of people that you can't meet, you can't write to because it's too expensive, you can't, it was a real problem. And I thought, well, maybe if we build something with the World Wide Web. And I remember my colleagues at the time said, well, yeah, but that's all right, Christine, you're a computer consultant, you've got computers, these things are expensive, nobody else can afford them. But I thought, well, I'll build it and see who comes. And then along came, what's his name, who started Amstrad, who, Alan Sugar. Yes.
Oh, right.
Yes. Who produced a proper home computer for about £500, I think it was. And yeah, at the time, usually they cost about £3,000 or £4,000. Remember that, buying a computer, even the discounts I could get, was like buying half a car.
Wow.
That's so much. So I suppose in today's money, thinking about quite often people spend about £20,000 on a car. The equivalent value was probably having to find £10,000. But this really smashed that barrier, and people started. There was something to go to what we were providing, and consequently, it was a sort of virtuous circle. So one of my contributions towards Press for Change in those early days was to create that website and to, again, I only got an E for English at O level, and so suddenly I was the editor of this site and became a journalist and writing.
Well, it hasn't held you back.
I know, it's strange. I think it was just that I used English in a different way than the examiners.
That's like me in maths.
There's so many things I've ended up doing over the years actually were things that I was never thought cut out to do. And that was just one of them. And I think one of the delights of getting older is to find new things I haven't done and give them a try.
Absolutely, and you do have a very long CV, so it makes sense that you try a lot of new things and do them all very well as well.
Yeah, because I get bored easily as well, so I need stimulation.
Projects all the time. So in those early days, obviously Press for Change would go on to have some incredible achievements, kind of not least being fundamental in bringing about the Gender Recognition Act of 2004. Did you ever think Press for Change would go on to be as successful as it is nowadays?
I fortunately never thought about the end point. We knew what the end point was. We were very lucky as a group that we, right on the top of our letterhead and on the website, it was clear that we were there to campaign for legal recognition for trans people, because that was the nub of the problem in all our lives. And we would do that by, firstly, the fairly novel idea of using strategic litigation. That is, taking cases that, if you could present them in court, actually made your point and therefore could bring about change. I mean, that was the aim of Mark Rees going to the European Court of Human Rights, because if he'd won, then the government as a signatory had to do something about it. And in fact, it took 4 goes of people going to the European Court of Human Rights to get where we got. So after Mark, in 1989, there was a trans woman called Caroline Cossey, sometimes known to people as the model Tula. I think her most famous gig was to be on these huge advertising hoardings in a bikini, water skiing behind the Loch Ness Monster. And people probably went past this picture all the time and never realised it was a trans woman. But she took a case, as I say, on exactly the same grounds. And the interesting thing about this was that the European Court of Human Rights were very canny. Normally, if you lose a case, that's the end of it. It's decided, that point is covered. But they actually left it open each time. They said, this is an area where new knowledge is coming along all the time. We don't really understand the place of the term used the other day was transsexuals in society, and medicine keeps telling us new stuff, and law is developing as well. So they thought we should enable people to come back to this. So there was Caroline Cossey in 1989, and then in 1997 there were 2 applicants called Christina Sheffield and Rachel Horsham, and they lost, but only just. If one judge on that occasion had decided to vote the other way, then they would have won at that time. And so by that point, the government was living on borrowed time. It was making the same tired old arguments to defend what was becoming increasingly the indefensible. So when the fourth case came along, and again it involved two applicants, Christine Goodwin and somebody we only know as I, but again very, very similar circumstances and the same kind of detriments through not being able to change your documents and being able to marry and so on. And at that point in 2002, it was a plenary session of the European Court, which involved 17 judges. And I think the word that came back to us afterwards was that they were all thoroughly pissed off with Britain by this point, because every time the government had said, this is very difficult, but we're keeping it under review and we're looking at what we can do. And every time they came back, they had done nothing. And 15 years had progressed with doing nothing. And the European Court thought, well, yeah, there's only 4 countries in the whole of the Council of Europe who don't have some form of Gender Recognition Act. And they were Britain, the Republic of Ireland, Albania, and Andorra. So that was the sort of company we were in. We were really the outlier. So at that point in 2002, they said, no, enough. We in legal words, they expressed that the time for keeping this as an open question was over, and actually it shouldn't be beyond the wit of HM government to fix this. And in fact, HM government had already been looking at potential solutions in any case by that point. So it was a case of really having to drag the government kicking and screaming to do something which wasn't actually very hard to do. It's just that we weren't a priority of theirs.
So why do you think it took Britain so long to enact this piece of legislation? Because I think a lot of people would like to consider UK generally as quite a progressive place. Do you think there was a cultural reason behind it?
Yes. And this, a very recent book that's just come out by one of my former associates in the campaign, Professor Zoe Playden, actually explains that in shocking detail. The thing that confused us all was that really this was such an open and shut case of injustice, particularly if you believed anything about the point of the human rights principles. And it seemed increasingly inexplicable over the years. But when you read this book, which is about how one trans man, by transitioning and changing his birth certificate, which people were able to do in those days, and actually really shocked and scared the establishment, because he and another contemporary had both been in line to inherit a baronetcy as a result of, through transition and legal recognition, having become the eldest male heir in the family. And consequently, well, if that could be done, then, let's say in extremis, Princess Anne could be a trans man and suddenly challenge, the line of succession to the throne. Or Prince Charles could be a trans woman and suddenly not be the heir to the throne. And that sort of uncertainty really, if I may use a technical term, put the willies up the constitutional establishment. But it goes all the way down the line, because the House of Lords is packed with people who are there only because they were the eldest man in the family. And similarly, the lands, the estates, the property that they had were inherited probably because they were the eldest male heir. So, to suddenly accept the idea that people could transition and then that actually have legal effect as though they had been born that way from the very beginning, that really upsets the apple cart. And it does so in a way that's fairly unique to Britain, because we are so wedded to this, this patriarchal idea of the passage of power from men to men. Other countries don't, they may have some of it, but they don't have it to the same degree. And at least they recognise they've got the disease. But in Britain, we didn't fully appreciate, because, we weren't members of the aristocracy. We didn't appreciate the extent to which that really obsessed the people who have the levers of power. They could never say it outright, but in what happened to Ewan Forbes, and is told brilliantly by Zoe Playden, it was very, very clear that that's what was at work.
And it sounds so outdated when we kind of talk about the Constitution and kind of aristocratic lines of inheritance. But I suppose that same argument is recycled today as well in the idea that people might pretend to be transgender in order to gain access to certain gendered spaces. Do you think there are parallels between back in 2002 and nowadays? Not sure in quite the same way. I don't think the people who spread fear and doubt about people like me are coming from the position of worrying about what recognising me as a woman does for the whole system of inheritance. Where they're coming from, I think, is a tradition that's always been used against minorities since the year dot. Lots of people are saying that all the things that are said to scare you about trans people at the moment are actually simply reheated versions of what was said to scare people about gay men in the 1980s, or indeed gay women as well. I remember, Martina Navratilova was accused almost on the front pages of tabloids of stalking the changing rooms at Wimbledon. That nice heterosexual girls were not safe because she was a lesbian. The other arguments were things like that they are trying to groom and recruit children. Well, that's being reused now, in that trans people are supposedly trying to recruit and trans young girls. What they're actually meaning is that trans boys, trans young men, are coming out sooner because they realise there's something that they can do about the thing that they've been carrying since they were conscious. But we're not having a sensible conversation about those things. Well, we were before this backlash started. Yeah. In fact, I guess I was guilty of complacency that by about 2015, and I retired and I'd written my book, Trans Britain, and I was intentionally made my book a positive arc of progress from people having really bad times in the 1950s and before to a fairly well-known disc jockey transitioning without it being a big issue in, I think, 2013 or 14. And there was a trans star on Orange is the New Black, and there were trans MPs, not in Britain, but in other countries. So we were getting noticed, and we were making progress, and that progress seemed to be all in one direction. Until you get to about 2016, of course, the Trump year and the Brexit year, when suddenly that came screeching to a halt, and out of the blue almost, you get these scare stories, which, as I say, are not new. They're old and reheated, but they've been given a new vigour, as though somebody was actually giving them the green light. Because the only thing that stops all this anti-trans stuff being just a potty fringe is because it's infected the upper reaches of most of our respectable newspapers and the BBC, so that suddenly the bastions of journalism you sort of try to rely on as being arbiters of what's true, were suddenly putting out huge volumes of lies, which
the slightest, any scrutiny, I can't say the word scrutiny at all, would show to be lies. But we're in the age where people lie, without embarrassment and with impunity. So we're stuck with that for the time being until Britain and America come to their senses.
And you mentioned kind of the Trump years following. Do you think this backlash in the media was a response to that, or do you think it was the other way around? What was the tipping point?
One of the tipping points that's been identified was in 2017. I should say there's plenty of evidence that across a range of social issues, there is huge amounts of money coming from the evangelical right in the US across to many places in Europe to try to advance their putting back the clock objectives for women's rights of bodily autonomy, for on abortion, on contraception, and trans people are seen as being really low-hanging fruit and almost a gateway drug into that. And in 2017, there was a meeting of these groups in the US, an event called the Value Voters Summit, where the idea was advanced that for American evangelicals, they had lost in 2013 with the acceptance of equal marriage in the US, and we'd had marriage equality in Britain as well. And it was a comprehensive defeat for them. The thing that organised them and got money coming into their coffers from parishioners was this fight against same-sex marriage, and they'd lost. And for a couple of years, they were totally disoriented. What do we do? How do we come back from this? And then the idea was put forward that, well, the strategy to do that is to try and break up the coalition of L, G, B, and T. And to do that, probably the easiest fault line to attack was to try and peel off the T part, the trans. And so that's actually where strategies began to be formed. For instance, to argue that trans people have no place in the LGBT movement, and that's translated in Britain into the existence of groups which pretend to be lesbian, gay, and bisexual groups, but spend their entire time campaigning against trans people. And there were plenty of talking points, as we've discussed already, many of these going back many years, but were sort of dusted off. And these evangelicals who would, really like to have control of every woman's womb, were not ashamed to team up with people who call themselves feminists and take on the language of feminism as well. So you see this stuff which is, it sounds acceptable because we're used to hearing the feminist arguments down the last 50 years since the second wave began. But it's false flag stuff. But if you are a small fringe group in Britain and somebody is coming along and maybe waving support in your direction, particularly at the time where it's really easy to crowdfund these days, and that crowdfunding has turned into a very easy way of laundering money from across borders. I'm not pointing the finger in any particular direction here, but certainly you look at some of the crowdfunders that have happened, and there are some extremely suspicious looking transactions. I remember one occasion where within 2 minutes on an ordinary weekday morning, 2 donations of £12,500 were made to a campaign anonymously. Now, I don't think you've ever done statistics. that cannot happen by chance.
No.
So it's huge amounts of money, lots of temptation, obviously lots of praise from people saying you're doing well, you know. So I think there's a lot of grooming of some of the people that are actually involved in this kind of movement, but also because it uses the language of early second wave feminism, and there are people who are now of an age and seniority in the media. They grew up with that language and see it and actually think this is a good thing. That you get it's so counterintuitive, and it is incredibly scary that you get organisations from, you know, the extremes of the Economist, the Spectator, the New Statesman, all the way through to the Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Guardian. You know, there's no particular political colour that isn't actually mouthing these exact same arguments. So, yeah, I'm back to how I felt in the late 80s, looking at the lie of the land and thinking, now, how on earth do we change things? And it being scary to think that it seems insurmountable. And right now, that's what this looks like. That, you know, it seems to have all the levers of power. All we've got on our side is the truth.
And I suppose in the 80s, you mentioned already there was no legal protection for trans people at all. So that seemed like an obvious thing to accomplish in order to have some protection. Whereas nowadays we do have some legislation in place. What can we do as a society to kind of overcome this horrible attack that the media is portraying at the moment? What can we do in order to stop it? I
think the most important thing is, we know from surveys that actually, although it sounds like they've got a majority of society, they're actually a very tiny minority. They're just a very powerful minority. On Twitter, for instance, I found that I can make myself safe from having people dogpiling anything I say simply by having blocked. Well, it was initially about 2,500 people. It's grown a little bit since then. But, you know, you block those people, they can't read your tweets, they can't respond to your tweets, and therefore they cannot attack you by the means that the social media makes possible. And that really brought home to me how small this thing was, but actually how effectively it was using smoke and mirrors to tell people that it wasn't. But yeah, for the most part, I think outside of these little echo chambers that exist on social media and, you know, the nonsense that unfortunately, you know, those newspapers and the BBC is now putting out, most people actually, you know, what trans people do or are alleged to do isn't in the front of their mind. Maybe they know a trans person, in which case, yeah, the stuff just is, oh, that's silly, I'll just ignore it. If they don't or think they don't, well, they're probably mistaken, because they probably met one of us at some point or other being served in a shop or on a call centre or whatever. Or they just passed us in the street and didn't know we were trans. So, but I think the more people who can actually motivate themselves to stand up and call this stuff out, just as we're getting geared now to call out climate change denial, and that we need to call out anti-vaxxers. We similarly, I think it needs many more sensible, upstanding, rational people to actually stand up and say, stop this. You know, this is a campaign based entirely on falsehood. And I don't care how important you are, how well your byline is known, you are putting out rubbish. And the more people who say that, I think it becomes a snowball effect, because I think everybody at the moment is a bit afraid to do that, because the people who have stood up for trans people in social media find that they have these brigades of people with no, all the time in the world apparently, to actually descend on them and say, so you hate women, do you? And all the other things that they throw at people to try and invalidate them. So we've got to get past that and actually at least outnumber those people who do the social media nonsense. And further up the food chain, I think for colleagues in the media to start to really call out their colleagues who, if they call themselves journalists, they need to be sacked. And I'm not, attacking, by calling for sacking, unfortunately, but it's just an observation that I know how journalism works, and I know, even when I put a book review into a newspaper, I will get edited to within an inch of my life by people asking hard questions. That's right. That's how it should work. That's how journalism is supposed to work. So it defeats me how there are so many very senior people in British journalism who have bought this nonsense hook, line and sinker, and are just prepared to keep repeating it and promoting it with the power of their position. Somebody somewhere has actually got to call time on that. Otherwise, we're stuck with it.
Absolutely. And speaking of the media, I know the BBC's just opted out of the Stonewall's diversity initiative, kind of for similar reasons. What do you think of that?
Well, it's irrational for starters. They say that it's because of impartiality. The BBC employs 22,000 people. Very few of those are actually on screen or in editorial or news gathering positions. Most of the people who work for the BBC actually on the payroll are in admin, or they're in engineering, or they are in one of the crafts that builds sets and does makeup and all those things. The actual people front of camera or writing stuff on BBC News is a tiny minority. And the Stonewall scheme is about being a good employer. It doesn't say anything about what you may or may not say in the news that you put out. So it's to say that they can't be associated with the country's biggest LGBT charity, Europe's biggest and oldest LGBT charity, because of impartiality. It's just insulting people's intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking of social media more generally, you said that there's kind of dogpiling and there's particular aspects of it which are unique to that platform. You've obviously been an activist for a number of years now. You've mentioned at the start of this that you were paper-based and then emails that was introduced. What's the landscape of political activism like now versus when you first started?
Well, I never felt afraid before. And I've spent most of my time as developing as an activist, of being prepared to stand on stage. And I used to start out by always beginning by saying, I'm a trans woman, just to make sure that the audience knew, what my position is. And I'm not just a well-intentioned cisgender woman. And that was never a problem for me. And I could explain things. And I could provide the evidence, and people would nod and they would believe and they would understand the rationale of what we were saying. There was no rocket science about the things that we achieved over about 12 to 15 years with Press for Change. We took arguments to courts, such as, for instance, to say that discriminating against somebody because they are trans in work is sex discrimination. That needed to be argued for. And we won on the facts and the arguments. Similarly, we won gender recognition on the facts and the arguments. And on the patience, because we had to go to court 4 times in Europe to achieve that. For people to ever say that this has been sprung on society and never talked about and not debated, and say they want a debate at this point, is ridiculous, because we had that debate more than 20 years ago, in some cases 25 years ago, employment protection has been on the statute book. We put it there in 1999, so that's 22 years ago, and courts have had no problem in actually determining unfair dismissal cases. No awful problems have come out of that. The law has worked incredibly well, and in fact mostly it was actually picked up and stuck into the Equality Act in 2010, where again nobody had any problem with actually understanding what it meant in terms of protecting trans people's rights to use services as well as access employment safely. So you know, it really, I guess, does my head in that after so many years of having done all this, had all the discussions, and very amicably with people on the facts, and sometimes we take away something and have to prove it a bit more. It was debated in the House of Lords, in committee, then in the House of Commons, in committee, and then back to the House of Lords. It was passed by a massive majority in 2004 in the House of Commons. The Gender Recognition Act, although it wasn't perfect, is really sound law in terms of what it actually, everybody agreed that it needed to be done. So how we've ended up 15, 16, 17 years later, pretending that none of that has happened, and as though trans people have just been invented, it just beggars the imagination, and it just reminds you that none of this is real. No, this is confected. This is people believing now that because you can lie scurrilously and get away with it. You know, America had an attack on its democracy in January, and the people actually responsible for that are still running around free. You know, that gives a really bad message to anybody who wants to take another pot shot at democracy or wants to take a pot shot at anything. You know, we've gone absolutely doolally over vaccinations. Well, I grew up, you know, with a succession of needles stuck in my arm for things that could have killed me. And we had no problem until suddenly, facilitated by social media, we have people being frightened away from what's good for them. You know, as an advanced, intelligent species, we have completely lost our heads over the last decade, and we seem to have lost them because we put in place this wonderful thing called social media without having any kind of controls over it. You know, I know, you know, you couldn't do, you know, if you wanted to put an ad in a paper in the old days, you know, it had to be legal, decent, honest and truthful. None of that applies to social media. And we had those rules evolved over many years because they made sense. And we've unleashed this incredibly powerful thing where any idiot can actually, you know, have a platform as big as anybody else and have no ramifications for the nonsense they tell.
It must be quite exasperating. I think definitely that the fake news is something a lot of people can relate to. And seeing as though there is a lot of misinformation online, where can people go to learn about the history of trans people and what we need to do next? What are some recommendations for reading lists and sources of information?
Well, this is where I think my English teacher would be most gobsmacked because I've seemed to have turned into a purveyor of books.
A published author.
Yes, not just a published author, but somebody who actually reviews and decides, you know, what are the things that people should read. And books are important. For one, because they still have a legitimate and really careful editing process. But also because they can really go into a subject in a way that 300 words in the corner of a column can't do, or in a 3-minute soundbite on the telly. So obviously, trans people have been writing books for years. I have a list that I put on my Twitter where you can pick from around 70 currently available books. So there's no shortage of knowledge. But I think in terms of where to start, and I'm really conscious of this for people who are coming from the outside and seeing this and realizing it's a very, to use the term, toxic territory. How on earth do you make any kind of start? What could you read that you can be safely assured is not trying to pull the wool over your eyes? So I'm going to, shamelessly plug my own book to start. So Trans Britain is a book that I started on in 2016, and it was pulled together in 2017. And the remarkable thing about this was that in July 2017, when I sent it off to the publishing system to be gone through by a structural editor and proofread and everything else, there wasn't this backlash. So it was written without any regard to what might then be about to happen. But by the time it was published in January 2018, as I say, the world had lost its mind. But what I felt was actually important to do, because so little has ever been accurately told about trans people over 100 years to the press, is that we needed to try and have some reference point for telling the history of a community. And I think this applies, I've done this with colleagues on disabled people's history and lesbian and gay history. It's a starting point, I think, to understand any social politics, is to understand where it's come from and what the pinch points are, what the controversies are, what it has had to go through even to get to where it is. Why did we have anti-discrimination legislation in the 1960s, the first Race Relations Act, then the second one in the 1970s, and the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975? Those didn't happen, just burst on the scene. There's a story behind them. And similarly, where trans people are now has a story behind it. And it's a history for minorities. It's very often hard to excavate history because we don't write in our own voices in the places that get archived. There were very few trans people had access to be able to publish. We never got given the opportunity to write our own tale in the newspapers. Certainly not until, we got it in about 2010 and then it was taken away again. So to actually excavate what that history was an interesting challenge. So I thought the best way to approach this was to find all the people who could say from their eyewitness perspective what had happened at various points in history. And we're at a point now where there are people who know what happened in the 1940s who are in their 80s, and it's important to get their story down. And there are people in their 20s who know far better than me what happened in the noughties, and likewise want to get their story down. So that's what Trans Britain is, rather than, although I've written quite a lot in it, really my job was to bring together those voices, nearly 24, and actually knit them together into a sensible order that itself tells a historical timeline. So that's Trans Britain, and it's been out now. It's about to have its 4th birthday.
Oh,
but then, so that was the first choice. The second choice, and we've mentioned this already, sort of picks up from there. This is a fantastic book by a young author. This is her debut book, but she's a journalist and speaker called Sean Fay. And just to make a point, by the way, about 10 days ago, she was hounded off Twitter. So she's gone. She had 45,000 followers. She had a voice on this big social media platform. And for the sake of her own health, because she's such an easy target, she decided to leave. But she'd already published this fantastic book, and it's a very clear cover, you can't miss it, The Transgender Issue. And that's the point of that title is, as she says, that people keep going on about us as though we're an issue. People talk about the transgender issue as though we're something to be debated, a problem to be decided by non-trans people, often in our absence. But the point she makes is that if you're having that debate on the grounds that are current in the media, put there by people who are against us, these stories about whether I'm a danger in the toilet or the changing room, or all these nonsense fears put about, then you're not actually dealing with the actual problems, because there are plenty of issues. The biggest one for trans people is that our access to healthcare has collapsed. One of the talking points against trans people is that doctors rush people through hormones and surgery, which they claim we will then regret. 40 years later, I have yet to regret mine. But the truth is that today, the chances are you will spend 5 years on a waiting list for your first appointment with a gender identity specialist. If you are a teenager and you're seeing your body change in a way that some aspects will be irreversible, then your puberty is most likely to be over before anybody starts looking at what might be done to put it on pause and prevent that and give you some time to think about it. So people are going to go into life literally marked by the neglect that they've experienced. But it goes further. She goes on to talk about the issue of class, because trans politics, trans life is very much a class issue. Now, I'm quite well off, so that when I transitioned, I was able to bypass the NHS, and my money bought me a safer life, and I was able to be a knowledgeable consumer of the services I needed. But if you're poor, then you're stuck with that 5-year wait, and so on. So there's that, and then she starts to go into all the areas of broader politics where really we should be working together with people, not having them think we're the enemy. There's a tremendous amount of understanding between trans people and sex workers, for instance, because we face the same kind of dangers. Many trans people anyway are forced into sex work just to survive. And we are, we have these same problems of bodily autonomy, and people thinking they know what's best for us. So we are natural allies, and we should be working together. And we have the same enemies. The people who class themselves as gender critical or trans exclusionary are also sex worker exclusionary. And want to do things with the law for sex workers, which actually make life extremely dangerous for them. She goes on to describe the ways in which, if it needed spelling out, lesbian, gay and bisexual people and trans people, actually share issues. Most obviously, because if you're going down the street and somebody decides to beat you up and you're a gay man, then it's probably more likely that they don't know who you slept with last night, but they are looking at all the signs of not conforming with gendered expectations, whether it's the way you walk, whether it's because you're obviously holding hands with another man, or with another woman in the case of lesbians. It's not, the root of hatred of lesbian and gay people is about breaking gender conformity rules. So, we belong together as we always have, and we recognise that, and we've got each other's backs. We may have slightly different paths in life, But there's a fantastic podcast called Coming Out Stories, which shows the coming out experiences of different lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people. And some of the facts are different, but the experience is identical right across the board. It's a shared experience, which validates why we really are a community. And then she goes on to explain how in a similar way, trans people and women and people are working for gender equality, and particularly trans women and cisgender women share interests as well. Not only does our experience of crossing the gender lines bring an awful lot of understanding to how gender works in society and what it is as a mechanism of patriarchal control, but we experience the same risks. If I walk down a dark road at night, I'm in exactly the same danger, whether I was born with a vagina or I had none made. There is the people who bring danger to our lives don't distinguish. So again, for many years, feminists have understood this, and we've been natural allies. And these Johnny-come-latelys who've come along calling themselves feminists, but actually really putting forward a strongly patriarchal, divided view, a very essentialist view of what it is to be a woman as a vessel for making babies and for keeping the house. They are the danger to our to all our welfare in the future. So there's I've probably told the story in the book really, but you still need to read it because she says it a lot better. So this is I've said that this is a watershed book, because there has never been somebody who's really taken these issues and given them a good shake in the way that she's done in a very accessible way. So I do hope that this will carry. It's already a Sunday Times bestseller. I hope it will continue being so for a long time to come, because there's an awful lot of people who need to read it. And then, last but not least, and only just published this week, and I've mentioned it already, is this brand new book by Zoe Playden, The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes. This is the advanced review copy, so it's not the cover you'd see in the shops. But this is a fantastic. So we knew this story before, because when Zoe found out the thing that put her on the track, she was still working with us, but at the time still having a job and not having time to really dig into the background. This is a case of a person who was born into an aristocratic Scottish family in 1912, identified at birth as a girl and initially brought up as a girl, but even by the age of 6, so we're talking then about 1918, it was very clear that there was something different about Ewan. So Ewan was very fortunate in having a very caring and forward-thinking mother who, now that the First World War was over, took Ewan around the medical specialists of Europe, and synthetic testosterone, sex hormones, had only just been invented, and people were finding out what they could do with it. And all the doctors on meeting Ewan agreed that actually he was a he. There was even as a young teenager, it was apparent, and that the sensible thing to do before his endogenous female sex hormones presented breasts and made him widened his hips and all the other things that happen, was that actually if they gave him testosterone, which he received in the early 1920s, then he would just mature, go through puberty as a boy, as a young man, and be totally, nobody would know that he had ever not been a boy. And so that is what happened. He lived a fairly, given the fact that he was from a family that was, had huge Scottish estates and lots of money. It was not a particularly remarkable life. He studied to be a doctor, and he was, again, I think, regarded as being a competent but unremarkable local doctor in that part of Scotland. And he formed a dancing group with the woman who would become his wife. And in order to marry her in 1952, he did what trans people did in those days, which was to change his birth certificate. There were rules that the registrar of births allowed for a birth certificate to be corrected and reissued. And so he presented the argument that he fell into that category and therefore should be recognised as a man. So as a man, he married his wife, they settled down. And again, that would have been unremarkable. But when his father died, his elder brother inherited the estates and two titles, Baron and Baroness, or I'm not sure exactly which, but these were titles that come down the male line. And then sadly in 1966, his brother died as well. And because he was then the eldest male heir, he was in line to receive that title and the estates. But suddenly, from nowhere, appeared a cousin who I guess is probably best described as a bastard, who determined he was going to have both. And he would do that by challenging whether Ewan was a real man. And sadly, he got Ewan's sister involved in saying no, he'd been a girl when he was born and grew up, and so he could never have been a real man. So that actually gave rise to a court case, which was held in private, so as to keep all the the wagging tongues away. And I'm not going to go into the detail here because there's quite a lot of skullduggery involved. But to cut a long story short, he prevailed, which is just as well, because if he hadn't, then the court would have actually found that his marriage to his wife was perjurious, and they would both have gone to prison. So, this was something played for incredibly high stakes. But as I say, he prevailed. But following that, the authorities decided that this should never become a question again. And therefore, that was in 1968. The following year, there was a much more famous case of April Ashley's divorce with, again, another landed member of the gentry, Arthur Corbett. And the shocking thing was that the judge insisted that April Ashley's counsel should not mention the Ewan Forbes case. And in fact, it was sealed and just conveniently lost in the records. So it was not treated as precedent. And instead, the judge concocted the tests that he wanted to have in order to show that April Ashley's marriage to Arthur Corbett had never been valid, and therefore, because it wasn't a marriage, she couldn't inherit anything from him on them getting divorced. So at that point, with a new test, our ability to simply have our birth certificates changed, as we'd enjoyed unimpeded for at least 50 years, was stripped away. That door was shut, and the judge in the Ashley case had decided that trans people were of the sex that was registered at birth, and that could not be changed. And consequently, that created the kind of circumstances that eventually drove Mark Rees to court. So it was, it really took away from us for about 35 years the rights that we needed in order to to live quiet, unobstructed lives. So that, as I say, the book has just been published. It's given how much of Ewan Forbes's life and these details have been obscured over the years, that she's managed to produce such a comprehensive and readable biography is nothing less than heroic. It is. You can read it on just as the biography of a really interesting Scottish laird, or you can read it as this story of walking for 80 years in a trans man's shoes and understanding how he was forced to navigate the world when the world was being put against him. So it's so between those three books, so that's probably a good month's reading. If you actually read all three of those, you are an expert on trans. But actually, you can just read any one of them and and understand what the issues are, I think. So those are my recommendations. But as I say, there are plenty more. It depends what aspect of the trans issues you want to understand.
No, that's an absolutely fabulous place to start. Thank you for that. And unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our time today. So all that's left to say is Christine Burns MBE, thank you so much for chatting with me. It's been so interesting. And everyone, make sure you go and buy a copy of Trans Britain. I promise you, you won't regret it.